To disagree productively is a challenge. To argue your case objectively is a skill. A careful study of logic and philosophy will give you the tools that you need. That's why FTNCI is hosting this ongoing book study Saturday mornings 9 a.m. Eastern on Zoom. I'm Cody Leibold, and this is our 7th meeting. We are finishing out our discussion of Chapter 2, the anteroom of Epistemology, in Leonard Peikoff's book Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. You can register to join the discussion or to find all the replays at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. The reading this week is pages 62 to 72, and that includes the subsections Human Action, Mental and Physical, as both caused and free, and Volition as axiomatic. As with the reading that we did last week, I found places that I disagree with this material. The disagreement is over exactly how to understand what volition is and how to understand the sense in which a person is himself a causal agent, while also maintaining the idea of causality and especially the principle of sufficient reason in regards to what created the person that is now making the decision. In regard to the concerns raised in this chapter, I am in agreement with Peikoff in his concerns, his intentions, what he wants to uphold. He wants to uphold causality. He also wants to uphold the reality that human beings are moral agents that make meaningful choices. And he points out that this is necessary. If you're going to have epistemology, if you're going to have any kind of ethical theory, you're going to need to be talking to people about how this is the right way to make decisions, on the presumption that they have volition, that they can choose to listen to your advice or not, that they can reason through it or not. So we agree fundamentally. It's just we disagree on some aspects. So for example, Peikoff will say something like man is the prime mover. And I'm going to look at that and I'm going to say, in relation to the question of the man making the decision and his own his awareness of what it is that he is facing, he is the prime mover. But in relation to all of the things that led up to him being what he is, how could you say that he is the prime mover if God is the prime mover? And so Christians are going to have a problem with objectivism. So that's how I generally approach this issue, is I would say in relation to the man making the choice, yeah, the fundamental is that he chose to focus, and that's a choice that in that question, it is the fundamental. But that doesn't mean that there is no other way to frame this question. And I think that the Christians, and especially Jonathan Edward, and anybody that's in the Calvinist school of theology and philosophy, is going to look at this question of free will quite differently on that issue of what led to the person being the person to make that kind of decision. And we are going to do a better job, I think, than Ayn Rand or than Leonard Peikoff of upholding the principle of sufficient reason or principle of sufficient cause. So we do agree with the objectivists that volition is axiomatic. We agree that volition is a key concept that we have to uphold. It's just a question of what is volition. And so many of the points that they make, we say, yes, 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 but maybe not in the way that you mean it. So we do believe that there is a fundamental choice to focus your mind or not. We agree with that. And there's most of the things that he says in here I'm going to agree with, but want to slightly reframe. And I think that might be the way you would think about it too, Jacob or Andrew. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I agree. And just to touch briefly on the topic of the prime mover, we don't even believe that God, as the prime mover, has the kind of quote unquote freedom or volition that they are implying here, where there's no sufficient reason for the fundamental choices that he makes, right? So they're going even further than just ascribing some divine status to man. That's not the essence of our objection. They're going even further than that and ascribing an irrational status to man, which some Christians also ascribe to God because they think that that's genuine freedom. But we would object to that entire notion of freedom altogether, and we can get more into that.
Thanks for that. So I find this topic challenging. Out of all the topics that I've looked at within philosophy and within theology, this is one that it was difficult for me to even become a Calvinist because I believed in free will before I started studying theology. And I took it that Calvinism was denying free will. There's a lot of confusion out there. The defenders of Calvinism don't always do a good job. And the opponents of Calvinism sometimes are quite loud. And so, I've had to blaze a trail through these issues. And I didn't always have somebody that was going to come beside me and say, you should read this and not read that. So it's difficult. And then when I was reading Opar, I've read Opar multiple times, maybe 8 times or more over the years since I first encountered it. And my idea of what is being said in this chapter has changed as I have learned more about other people's views on the issue. It's the way it is with philosophy. You read one person and then you read someone else, and then it gives you more light on those ideas. And in order to have what I think is a better foundation for understanding the material in this chapter, I went and I've been reading through Jonathan Edwards' book that was recommended by Jacob and Andrew, and that's The Freedom of the Will. And I've also read through Edwin A. Locke's book, The Illusion of Determinism. Locke is an objectivist, a student of Ayn Rand, and his book is in agreement with Peikoff as far as I can tell. So I've come at this with the mindset of I want to make sure I really understand what these people are saying. And in order to offer a robust Calvinist Christian response to Opar, I think that it's going to take more than what I can do right now. I've just come to that conclusion that I can engage with this material, and I can say, I think this is what they're saying. I think that I disagree to this extent, but I think there's a lot of questions that are not answered in the objectivist literature. And so it's difficult to have an opinion on everything that has been said here because it's not quite clear what their meaning is some of the time. Do you guys have a similar experience of that?
Yeah, I think that you're right that they don't go as far as we would like, right? Or as far as they normally do go in analyzing an issue or concepts. It seems like they get to a certain point and then they sort of stop without any rationale for why they stop there. And it's sort of a just so, it just is what it is, and there's no further explanation for it. It's sort of just an assertion without an argument or a rationale. However, on the other hand, having read a lot of the academic philosophy literature on this topic, at least contemporary stuff, it seems like Peikoff, at least here, is taking a very similar tact as many academic philosophers who want to affirm something like the principle of sufficient reason, which I think Peikoff would want to try to affirm, right? While also affirming libertarian free will. I think of Alexander Pruss, who wrote the book, The Principle of Sufficient Reason. And it's a thick book. He might even be at Baylor.
Yeah, Baylor.
Yeah, he's a very renowned philosophy professor. It's a very robust defense of the principle of sufficient reason on multiple fronts. But on the topic of libertarian free will, he's got a whole chapter on it, of course, because he has to. He sort of does the same thing that Peikoff does here, which is kind of just get to a point and then say, and that's all we can say about it, and we have to move on. And you're left thinking, well, why do we stop there? What's the rationale here? So, yeah, that's my assessment.
Yeah, one example of that is when Peikoff goes at great lengths to show that free will is not at odds with the principle of cause and effect, the law of causality. And he says, if a man chooses the reality orientation, then the higher level choices he makes will be shaped by causal factors relevant to a process of cognition. And then he says vice versa. But kind of a question for people who are trying to understand these concepts together, their question is going to be, well, okay, I agree with that, but is there a cause that accounts for the decision to choose the reality orientation? Now, I think even over and separate and apart from that is the very interesting and insightful thing, stuff that he has to say about, well, what does it look like when you are choosing those things? How does it affect every area of life? And I think those places are where we would say there's a ton of value in what he's saying, even if he skirts around the issue of the libertarian aspect of free will. But he at least affirms that it's not, our choices aren't random. And so as far as he goes in that direction, I think we're like, yeah, that's great. But I think even where he seems to be saying similar things to what we're saying, he will still take the implication that it would be impossible for God to know what's going to happen, because that would imply that we don't have free will. Again, there's kind of a lot of package deals being kind of smuggled in.
I found that there were times where in Peikoff or in Locke, they would say something that reminded me of what Jonathan Edwards would critique, this idea that the will chooses something, and Edwards would say, no, 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 it's the person. The will doesn't do the choosing. The person has the will. The will is the aspect of the person, but he has these devastating critiques here and there about, and he was critiquing Arminianism back in the 1700s. So he's not directly engaging, of course, with people that came after him like Peikoff and Ayn Rand, but the kind of critiques that he has are very well suited to addressing some of the things that I read in Peikoff. So, like for instance, he will. Well, let me see if I can find some of the things that I highlighted in here.
Sure. While you look, I want to mention, I think Isaac might be in now if you wanted to promote him. And then while you look, I'll just mention the essential similarity, I think, between Peikoff and modern day academic philosophers who advocate libertarian free will is that they will affirm that our choices have causes, in certain respects, right? That there are motivations there, and it might even be that there were sufficient causes for some choices you have now, but they'll say there had to be a fundamental choice, right? And that's what Peikoff is saying. There is a fundamental choice, an irreducible choice to focus or not. And while Pruss and other academic philosophers may not identify that as the fundamental, the commonality is that they will say that fundamental choice, whatever it is, was chosen for a reason. They'll say there's a reason for it, so it's not random, right? So it's their way to get out of the randomness objection. There is a reason for it. But in order to maintain that it's indeterministic, they'll say, but they could have acted differently for a different reason, which that is exactly what Peikoff is saying here, right? The choice to focus or not is a fundamental choice, but it's not causeless. That there's a reason behind it. You choose for a reason. But you could have chosen according to a different reason. And so it's really just pushing the question back one more step. And it's a way of not really answering the fundamental question that we're getting at here. Like, if you can do that, then why even posit that there has to be a reason to begin with? If you can say, well, it's not random to act for reason A over against reason B without any explanation, then why not just say it's not random to choose decision A over decision B without any reason, right? They're just pushing it back one step further,
Yes.
pretending that fixes it, but it doesn't.
Tell me if I'm reading this wrong, but it does seem like Peikoff is saying that fundamental choice is not explainable for some other reason. He said on 59, he says, a primary choice cannot be explained by anything more fundamental. And then in the next chapter that goes into page 60, next paragraph that goes into page 60, he says, there can be no motive or value judgment which precedes consciousness and which induces a man to become conscious. In short, it is invalid to ask, why did a man choose to focus? So I do think that he is saying there's not a reason for that fundamental choice. Mm-hmm. So he might disagree with some of the other libertarian free will proponents there. Unless I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
That might be a technical difference, but but in regard to any later choice to focus. So I think there he's sort of confusing the chronology of like your very first choice, mm-hmm. chronologically speaking. Yeah. There can't be anything preceding it because there's nothing in your mind. You haven't focused yet, so there's no content there. And that would make sense. But when it comes to down the road, once you've got content and you're choosing to focus or not in any given situation, I think that's where he talks about you do so for a reason. And I can't remember exactly where he says it, but yeah, regardless. Cody, did you have that?
Yeah, I have something to read from Jonathan Edwards. One other point I wanted to make is that in Locke's book, he does explicitly say that he is rejecting indeterminism. So, and I think that Peikoff would agree with that too, that what they are positing is not that there's some kind of metaphysical randomness, and that the metaphysical randomness, the void, is the origin of your choices. They're not indeterminists, or at least they don't think they are. And so then when we read them, we say, well, don't you think that you're implying indeterminism when you reject that there was a more foundational cause? So that's how I would understand that. But here, let me read the section from Jonathan Edwards. This is in his section concerning the notion of liberty and of moral agency. And I think this is clarifying. The language is a little bit antiquated, but once you get his point, I think it's very helpful. He says, but one thing more I would observe concerning what is vulgarly called liberty, namely that power and opportunity for one to do and conduct as he will, or according to his choice, is all that is meant by it. So when we speak of liberty, it's doing what you chose to do. That's what we are meaning by the term. Without taking into the meaning of the word anything of the cause of that choice. So we can all agree when we're talking about liberty that there is such thing as liberty, there is such thing as choice. And we can agree that it means that the person makes a choice. The person does something. When two things were before him that he could have chosen, he chose one. And we can all agree that that's what liberty is, without taking into the meaning of the word anything of the cause of that choice, or at all considering how the person came to have such a volition, whether it was caused by some external motive or internal habitual bias, whether it was determined by some internal antecedent volition, or whether it happened without a cause, whether it was necessarily connected with something foregoing or not connected. Let the person come by his choice anyhow. Yet, if he is able, and there is nothing in the way to hinder his pursuing and executing his will, the man is perfectly free, according to the primary and common notion of freedom. Now, the point he's making here is whatever your theory might be about what caused the man to be or what didn't cause the man to be, we can all agree that there is this volition. And so that I found that helpful. And then there's another point that he makes where, he's pointing out that freedom is the freedom to do that which you are most inclined to do. So freedom doesn't specify why you became inclined to do it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, real quick, I want to mention Isaac would like to be let out of his cage on video in the chat there. I think that's very similar to my reframing of the issue in my paper that I did on this, where we shouldn't be primarily thinking of this issue in terms of, is the will compatible with determinism or incompatible with determinism, right? If we're going to affirm free will, it's like everybody starts off with the question, all right, is free will compatible with determinism or not? And that frames the rest of the discussion. And I want to say, and I think Edwards is saying something similar there. Hold on, whoa. Why do we need to talk about the compatibility of this thing with something else, or the causal history of this thing, before we just talk about the nature of it, right? Can't we just establish the nature of what we mean by free will, regardless of the causal factors, regardless of whether or not it's compatible with this other theory? And once we do identify what it is, then we can have the secondary discussion of whether or not it's compatible with things like determinism or whatever else.
Oh, and it's really good too that he focuses on the point that volition is axiomatic. And as soon as you ask, how do you establish that we have choices, that presupposes the fact that I can choose to evaluate your answer. And I think that's good. Especially, I think the main enemies of this are, obviously, as someone who is reformed, it's not the people who think that the principle of sufficient reason dictates that all choices are going to have a sufficient cause. That's not the enemy of that view. The enemy of that view, really today, I think, are the people who go around focusing a ton on our cognitive biases. And you'll see this a lot in political areas, with race and gender, but you'll also see it just with kind of pop psychology and true, clinical psychology, academic psychology. There's a huge focus on, look at all these biases that we have. Look at how prejudicial human beings are. And then they kind of leave it up to you to say, well, am I really objective? I think those right now are the most popular and most powerful, socially speaking, in terms of the opponents that need to be answered with this sort of axiomatic response, that like anytime that you're going to present me with this theory of social science, I had someone say, there's a lot of good social science that shows that human beings just decide what they want to believe, and then they find evidence to get to that answer. And I kind of felt like this is a smart guy that was saying this, and I was like, I mean, I feel kind of dumb giving you what seems like a cliche answer, but aren't you expecting me to be able to say that that's objectively true? And it's almost like, I feel like I've got to be walking into a trap here, because that's such an obvious answer, that I have to be able to evaluate objectively this research that you're suggesting that I read. And I don't deny that there's that people do that very, very often, and decide on an outcome they want to be true, and then find their way to get to that by selectively looking at the data. But I would say those are really the people who need to be answered by Peikoff. Those are the people who Peikoff is really helpful to combat.
Because there is the choice to focus, and that is axiomatic. And if you deny that, then you'd be denying that we are human beings, that we are making decisions, and so on. Yeah, and it's the social determinists that's generally speaking, I think that's what Ayn Rand is attempting to combat. So, are there other discussion threads that you guys would like to pick up, or should we jump into the book? I think I'll jump into the book.
Yeah.
So let's go to page 64 in the very bottom of the page. Peikoff writes, in regard to the higher level actions of volitional consciousness, however, to be caused does not mean to be necessitated. And I think that this is one of his points where he's most strongly advocating something I would disagree with. He is saying that there is this way of your actions, your choices being caused, but not necessitated. And in my way of understanding these issues, the choices are both caused and necessitated. What do you think? Is this correct?
Yeah, I think the important part is just because he references material causality right before that, right? He talks about how consciousness isn't caused in the same way that matter is. In regard to matter, there is no issue of choice. To be caused is to be necessitated, right? So it's almost like he's thinking, if causation in regard to consciousness is to be necessitated, then that means that consciousness is effectively no different than matter, that there's no difference between the types of causation. And I wanted to say, well, why should we assume that? I agree that there's a fundamental difference between the type of causation in the material world and the type of causation in the spiritual or consciousness world. But that doesn't mean that the principle of sufficient reason or the law of causation changes. It just means that it's a different form. And he would say that much, right? He would say, yes, there's a distinction. Yes, the law of causation still holds. And by the law of causation, I think he means something similar to the principle of sufficient reason. But whenever they affirm, yes, the law of causation is active here, but it's not necessitated, essentially what they're doing is saying, I'm asserting that it's active, but taking it back in the next breath. Because it's meaningless. To say that it's active where there is no sufficient causation is meaningless.
Look at the top of page 65. He says, but the dilemma continues, quote, if man's actions do have causes, then they are not free. They are necessitated by antecedent factors. So he's representing the opponent's view. Mm-hmm. And he calls this the determinist view. So if you're trying to summarize the determinist view as being, if man's actions do have causes, then they are not free. They are necessitated by antecedent factors. Well, I don't think that being necessitated by antecedent factors means that you are not free to make a meaningful choice. So I reject the implication there that I'm rejecting volition. And if this position here is determinism, then I suppose I'm not a determinism, because a determinist believes that this implies that there's no freedom. So I don't know if I would be called a determinist. Jacob, would you say that I'm a determinist on the way that I'm accounting for this?
So I disregard the label. I don't think it's helpful because it does have that package deal
I
of
see.
it affirms the principle of sufficient reason the way that we want to, usually not in that language, but then it also affirms that inference of therefore choice is an illusion and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I want to just reject that entire label. And that's why I talk more about the principle of sufficient reason rather than talking about deterministic causation or whatever else. If you really flatten everything down and get rid of all distinctions, then you could say that they're the same thing in regard to causation. But there's too much package deal going on there to use the term helpfully, I think.
Yeah.
Now, Peikoff is also concerned about this because he says objectivism regards this dilemma as a false alternative. So he just might be concerned about it in a slightly different way than we are. So it's like there's 4 different viewpoints on the field here, and that's why it gets so confusing to discuss it. But man's actions do have causes, he writes. He does choose a course of behavior for a reason, but this does not make the course determined or the choice unreal. It all depends on what he means there by determined, I think. It does not, because man himself decides what are to be the governing reasons. Man chooses the causes that shape his actions. Well, I mean, I think Edwards would agree with that. We do choose what are going to be the most important things, but is there a reason why we choose? That's the point under discussion here. I don't know why Peikoff cannot seem to address that point.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I was talking about earlier, where they will affirm we choose for reasons, and that's the causation.
Yeah.
Okay, but why do we choose the reasons? Why do we choose for the reasons that we did rather than the opposite reasons?
Yeah.
And they've got a blank out there.
And a lot of people think if you say that, they'll say you're trying to ask questions and get us into a place where something external causes. But all we're saying is, no, why did you choose? Like, I've got good friends who are kind of not quite fully libertarian free will, but they kind of want to affirm it somehow. And they'll say, well, yeah, our actions are determined, but they're determined by us. I'm like, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly, I think, what we're all advocating. And of course, I think all parties involved in this discussion are admitting that external factors are going to shape what choices you make and what your, tastes are and things like that.
So I think a really important point to keep in mind is at the end of the day, this all boils down to what are you as an agent?
Yeah.
What is the you that's doing the choosing or the acting or the reasoning, etc. And at the end of the day, the person who affirms libertarian free will in whatever way that they affirm it, which I think Peikoff is affirming it here, has to say that the you that does the choosing is something over and above everything that we would say makes you you, right? It's something over and above your values, your beliefs, your dispositions. I would say, on their view, the you that does the choosing, the you as agent, is just a void. It's a characterless, definitionless void that is random. That it just randomly acts for this reason rather than that reason, and it could have just as easily acted for the opposite reason. And that's the whole point of libertarian free will, is that it could have done otherwise for no reason at all.
And they'll critique that when you get into ethics, because like Peikoff doesn't want to go, and rightly so, he doesn't want to affirm Kant, where he says you just have, the best way to act morally is to act for no motivation. Like Kant would say, and to the degree that an action is motivated by some interest that you have in the outcome, it's less moral. And Peikoff would rightly reject that. And it's almost like he should make the parallel identification here that to have real freedom and real agency, you shouldn't be acting apart from a cause that is in you, or like a determining factor that's in you. But I don't think that this mistake necessarily spreads to other areas so much as the Kantian one does, unless, of course, you were to say God ordains all things that come to pass. Of course, he would point to this and say, no, he can't, because that would mean there's no freedom. But as far as his own philosophy goes, I think I want to know if y'all agree. Do you think that it's the kind of error that infects other areas?
Well, I think any error can potentially infect other areas. I think whether or not it actually infects other areas in objectivism, I don't think it does a whole lot. There are some places here and there. But to elaborate a little bit more on this issue of what is the agent, and to show how potentially disastrous it is, think of John Galt, right? Hopefully everybody who's listened to this has read Atlas Shrugged. I don't want to give any spoilers, but spoiler alert. There's a point where John Galt, he's the hero. He's sort of supposed to be Rand's ideal man, the perfectly rational, etc. There's a point where Galt is talking about evasion, where Dagny was testing him to see if he would be evasive. If I'm remembering correctly, and he says, that's the type of blank out that destroys men's lives. I'm not capable of it. That's the type of dishonesty. I'm not capable of it. And Rand's saying right there, Galt has such a character. Has a character that he's built in himself, such that he's not capable of choosing to be dishonest. Now, step back and think about that. Is he less free because if he's being honest there, right? Is he less free because he's not capable of choosing evil? Because he's not capable of choosing dishonesty? Or is he more free, right? In a robust sense of the term, because he's acting according to his rationale, his long-term objectives, etc. Right? Well, obviously, we would say the latter, and this is also what I would affirm about God. Right? I would say that the idea that God has libertarian free will is horrendous, because then it's like, well, any second, God could choose to be suicidal. God could choose to act completely contrary to his nature. Or if you're not a Christian, if you're an atheist, if you're an objectivist, think about John Galt. Are you saying that, at any point, it would have been just as plausible for Galt to bow down and kiss Wesley Mooch's feet, or to bow down to James Taggart? It would have been just as plausible. It could have happened. He just chose not to for reasons.
Yeah, there's something that you pointed out there about Galt that it made me think of what Jonathan Edwards has, where he talks about how we can plausibly say that there is something that a person has the ability to will himself to do, and then there's something beyond that which he doesn't have the ability to will himself to do. And there are degrees of how much willpower you have, and we could say that it's just you could come up with any number of examples, but like you were just describing with John Galt doing things that were outside of his character. If there is such thing as something, some amount of power that you do have, and then it becomes harder by degrees, and then there's going to be some point where you've gone outside the limits, where you just don't have the power to choose that anymore. I think that's helpful in Edwards. You can read through his book, The Freedom of the Will, to see that. We'll go to Isaac in just a second, but I wanted to bring up a couple of points here. So on the top of page 68, we read that in regard to action, also, man is a sovereign entity, a self-mover. Is that something that we would affirm as Christians, that man is a sovereign entity and a self-mover? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate in the same way that man is responsible for himself, and in the same way that man shapes his own character in a lot of respects, right? So to say that man is a self-mover isn't to deny that God also moves us, in the same way that to say that man is responsible doesn't deny God's sovereignty over everything that happens in our lives, and everything ultimately that we're going to choose. I think what it means is it's just affirming that yes, you move you, and if you didn't move you, you wouldn't be responsible for what you do. You are in control of you. You are the captain of this ship, right? That old poem. I can't remember it all, but it's a great poem. You are the captain of this ship called you, called your life. You alone are responsible for it. You can't default and farm that out to other people. You can't default and float or coast. It's going to be a disaster. So yes, it's true that man is self-moving, and in some senses self-made in that sense, right? But that's not to deny that God is the ultimate causer and mover behind all of that.
And just to wrap up this discussion here on this subtopic, on the top of page 69, the content of one's choice could always have gone in the opposite direction. And then you skip down to the next paragraph. He says, on the primary level, man chooses to activate his consciousness or not. This is the first cause of a lengthy chain. Now, I'm thinking that in regard to man's action, the choice to focus is the first cause. But you have to frame it that way because there's other first causes as well. My son would never have acted had I not chosen to be his father and to have a son. I mean, there's obviously a chain of decisions that preceded my son's decision to focus in a given moment. And so, yeah, in regard to his consciousness, the fundamental was that he chose to focus. I agree with Peikoff there, but I don't think that you can therefore conclude that the content of his choice could have always gone in the opposite direction. I don't know if that would be implying libertarian free will. Do you think that implies libertarian free will?
Yes, that's the essence of libertarian free will, is all things holding equal, you could have chosen otherwise. That's the essence of libertarian free will, because it's saying that there is no causal sufficiency.
I just wonder if there's an ambiguity of language here, because when I look at a choice, for example, there's a road that turns right and turns left, and I look at it, I see there really is a choice in front of me, outside of me. There really is. And when I choose it, I really do choose it. That doesn't mean that in that exact situation that I had this indeterminacy, libertarian free will option that I might have chose. I mean, what do we mean when we say I might have chose it? I think there could be an ambiguity there.
Well, and that's why I say all things being equal, where all things includes you,
right?
You in that moment, and the sum total of all of your motivations, etc. Right? If all of that is holding equal, then you can't say it could have been otherwise.
Yeah, I had this conversation with some friends last year, and I said, I still say that I, did something like, I picked up this cup. I could have done, all things being equal, I couldn't have done otherwise, because you're including, like you just said, all of your reason states and mental states. And my friend was like, yeah, but I'm thinking like, if I was there, I could have done something different. And I was like, that's exactly right. But you just had to change the variables. Once you change those variables, a lot of stuff was possible. And that doesn't mean that anything is possible. Even when you change the variables of, well, what if I had wanted to do differently? Even when you expand it to that level of consideration, you're, like Jonathan Edwards says, you're still going to reach a limit. There are still things that you can't choose. Even when you consider, well, let me just not consider the exact desires of that moment. Let me just consider all the range of possibilities. There is still, I can't, even if I wanted to, I couldn't walk outside, flap my wings and fly. But, there is still a range of options that I could do. And it's still meaningful to talk about that, even when you affirm a full, sufficient set of causes for a decision. There's still a meaningful way to talk about that.
Yes, metaphysically, there's nothing that's preventing me from robbing a bank, in the same way that metaphysically I'm prohibited from flying by flapping my arms. But I'd have to be a different person than I am today to rob a bank 5 years from now. I'd have to become a different person. That's the point. All right, Isaac, you've been waiting. Let's see that face.
Hello, is it me you're looking for?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
Sorry. This idea of strength of character with going back to the John Galt analogy, it got me thinking about a lot of things. Why do we love the characters we love? And why do we hate the characters we hate? Characters in books, characters in movies. If you've ever been in a play, or if you've ever been in a movie, you get assigned a character. A character is someone with a background, someone with their own set of values or motives, a certain set of relationships. All of these things come together in a person, a character, and that determines how you act in the play or in the movie. And there's a consistency there. There is a thing called character development, and that happens over the course of time through experiences, things that happen to that character. And that changes the character. And what that means is it changes the set of actions that they will typically take. And I was thinking like a character that came to mind is like Dumbledore, someone that people can like relate with, or not relate with, but that they're familiar with. Why do people love Dumbledore? Well, certainly it's not because of libertarian free will. We don't expect Dumbledore to, in one hand, valiantly fight against Lord Voldemort, and then in the next second, kill Harry Potter with Avada Kedavra. Like, that would be pretty shocking. That would be, another way of putting it, that would be out of character for Dumbledore to just do that randomly. And I say randomly because it's out of character. Like, you would understand that action as it happening outside of Dumbledore's character. It's random. So we love the characters we love because they have a character that we love and we expect them to be consistent with. And Jacob said something about this idea of, is John Galt really free if he has such a strong character that it, for lack of a better way of putting it, it compels him to act a certain way? And regardless of like any discussion about like what freedom really means, just taking this thought of, is he really free? Like if his character compels him to act a certain way, my initial reaction to that was, well, if that's what it means to be a slave, I'll take that slavery. I'd rather have that strength of character to do the right thing and be a slave to that.
I'd point out that the freedom that John Galt has is the freedom to do what he is inclined to do, what is consistent with his values.
Yeah, and this is getting to the discussion of what does it mean? What does freedom mean, right? But this idea that you could have such a strong character that you could never go against it. And for somebody to say, well, can you really be free? I would say, well, if that's what freedom means, I'm okay. Like, I'm okay with that. For me, and that, then you can start talking about, well, what does freedom really mean? To me, freedom is doing the right thing and living by values and being consistent with those values.
Yeah. Think about what do we mean freedom? Freedom from what? In the context of free will, when we're talking about the free will, freedom from what? Do we mean freedom from external causes, like external to you? Yes. Do we mean freedom from yourself? From everything that makes you you? No. That's nonsense, right? And actually, Andrew and I were talking about that character issue. I was saying how that's one of the things I hate in shows or movies is when they make the character do something that's totally out of character. That because it's unrealistic.
Yeah.
It's anti-reality. It doesn't make any sense, and it's almost nihilistic. The way I think about it is it's nihilistic because it's denying that a given person has a character.
Yeah. If you read the Romantic Manifesto, which is where Ayn Rand talks about her theory of art, she talks about how she had to write, in the context of the Fountainhead, she had to write Howard Rourke a certain way in chapter 1. And because if she didn't, then in chapter 10 and in chapter 15, he could never have made the choices that he made. And she's grasping this completely right. She's like, if he had been this kind of wishy-washy, man pleaser in chapter 1, he never would have been able to turn down the commission that he turns down, later on, because of his chosen values. So, I think you're exactly right, Isaac. And honestly, a lot of the stuff they would affirm, but it seems to be a little bit inconsistent with the way they want to frame freedom. Because even in our own lives, the people that we love them because we think that there is a certain them, sitting there in front of us. And we know just because, they have unidentified inconsistencies like, we all do, but still there's them. And we know that in 5 seconds, they're still going to be them. So I think that's just kind of a little bit of an ostensive proof of what we're saying. We can say, hey, look at what you do. When you judge someone, you're like, you are something, and that kind of determines the choices you make.
There are a couple of other questions that I had about the remaining reading. So let's go to page 72. This is one that I wanted to ask what you all think, because if I understand this right, there's a big error going on here. This is, I don't know, a couple of paragraphs up from the very end of the reading. It says, will, in her view, is not something opposed or even added to reason. The faculty of reason is the faculty of volition. Now, I mentioned this last recording, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Is it true that reason, the faculty of reason, is the faculty of volition? Now, I would say that there is a faculty of reason. I would say that volition is a faculty of a person as well. I don't know if these two are identical. I know that they interrelate together because you have to use your decision-making ability when you reason, when you form concepts. And that's where we're going in the coming chapters. We're talking about how you have to make choices in order to conceptualize. That's true. But does that mean that, as he writes here, the faculty of reason is the faculty of volition? What are your thoughts?
I don't understand how that is supposed to be consistent with their view, because the whole point of this chapter is Peikoff is teaching that the fundamental choice is the choice to focus, the choice to activate your reason, right? So on that, when you're saying the fundamental choice is the choice, the act of the volition, the fundamental act of the volition is to choose to reason, you're treating them as separate things. Right, so I'm not sure what this is supposed to mean on his view. It sounds like it's just sort of a throw out. But I will say that I believe Edwards says that the will is the mind choosing.
Right,
and I agree with that. So I don't know that I would say that they are synonymous with each other, that the will and the mind, or the will and reason, are the same thing. I think it's better to put it the way Edwards does, which is the will is the mind choosing. There
is material in Edwards where he critiques this possible idea that the will wills, the choice chooses. It's like, no, the person chooses. And I think that's helpful in him. All right, so let's go back to page 69. There's just a section here called Volition as Axiomatic. And I think that we should summarize what our take is on this. There is some material in this section where we seem to find things that we would disagree with, as far as the libertarian free will implication or the denial of the principle of sufficient reason. But the main point of this section is one that I would endorse. Yes, volition is axiomatic. You cannot do any work in epistemology or ethics without acknowledging that we do have choice. So some things in here Let's go to page top of 70. So he says the concept of volition is one of the roots of the concept of validation. I agree with that. And then in another section, he says, how then do we know that man has volition? It is a self-evident fact available to any act of introspection. I agree with that. Just a question of what the definition is, but we know that there's something. You skip to the bottom paragraph on that page. The principle of volition is a philosophic axiom. And then he says, to direct one's consciousness, one must be free and one must know, at least implicitly, that one is. I agree with that. Go to the top of page 71. There's a section here where he does a reductio ad absurdum on what it would mean if you were to embrace determinism and then attempt from your framework of determinism to critique free will. You would actually be falling into, perhaps you would be destroying your own argument. Now, I'm not sure how compelling this is. There's some aspects of it where I'm just not sure. I agree with his conclusion. I'm not sure that the argument follows logically. I'd be curious if anyone had any thoughts on that section.
Lewis has a similar argument against materialistic determinism, where he basically is something along the lines of, if there's no difference regarding the causality between the action of your stomach and the action of your mind, then we should not ascribe any more significance to the action in your mind than the action in your stomach, right? If there's no difference between a belch and an idea, then why should we ascribe any significance to the idea more than we do to the belch?
Or any truth value.
How could it correspond to reality?
Yeah. Is my hiccup true? You could never say that. And when Jacob debated Tom Jump, you kind of pinned him on that. Like, how could a purely materialistic thought even correspond to reality? What would it mean for it to correspond? It's just, you have right over here, you have a desk, and then 3 feet away, you have someone's brain synapses. How do you say that those things correspond? They only correspond in the mental sense, in the mind. And if you're a materialist, then yeah, this reductio ad absurdum, I think, works. And I see a lot of people do this with free will, but I don't know how. I don't know. I don't think it would apply to our view. I don't think that it would work.
The flaw in Peikoff's argument in his reductio is that he's conflating determinism, including our view, which I would reject that label, but he's conflating applying the principles of sufficient reason to the will with materialistic determinism, and saying if any of that is true, then what follows from materialistic determinism follows, meaning that your will, your choice is an illusion. So his reductio applies to a view which affirms that the will is an illusion, but that's not our view.
Any other comments on that section?
I think I just want to know if you guys have any clarity for me, because I think I struggle to understand like fully what's going on here. And I think, so if we are like this idea of determinism, when we say we can't be fully deterministic beings, because if we were, then the only reason we ever say anything is because there was something in us that determined us to think that way. So therefore, it really means nothing, because that conclusion came from something materially or something else that determined it to be. And that's the only reason it is. But in our view, it can't be that way, because we believe that reality, that there is objective truth and we can know it. And I think I just want like my thought was, are we saying that objective reality, I don't know how to put it, is objective reality a thing that acts on us, and when we choose to allow it to act on us or to observe it acting on us, we can begin to form conclusions that conform to reality. And that's where the meaning, therefore, it is meaningful, and in terms of objective truth, because we're able to actually conform to it if we so choose. Does that make any sense?
That was quite a sentence.
Did that make any sense?
Could you summarize the question?
I'm just trying to figure out like what the idea is here, because with determinism we're saying it doesn't mean anything, because there are, like, in the view of determinism, there are things that determine it to be not objective truth, just things that determine it to be, so it doesn't mean anything, right? How would we state things?
So on the materialistic determinist view, there is no such thing as your mind. There's only chemical reactions. And that's why materialistic determinists say that choice is an illusion, because choice is something that goes on in the mind, and there is no mind. That there's just chemical reactions, right? And we reject that. We affirm that you are more than chemical reactions. You have a mind which is not reducible causally to the material world. But we would disagree with those who advocate for libertarian free will, because we say you choose according to what you want, your character. So the sufficient causation is not material. It's not determined materially from the material world, but it is sufficiently caused by your character, by who you are as a person, by your motives and everything. See, the advocate of libertarian free will wants to say that if your choice is sufficiently caused by your character, then it's no different than saying that your choice was sufficiently caused by chemical reactions. And we're rejecting that. We're saying, no, there's a significant difference between your choice being sufficiently caused by chemical reactions and your choice being sufficiently caused by you, right? Yeah. Saying that you chose is morally significant. Saying that the chemical reactions chose for you is not morally significant.
Right. I think I feel like there's some infinite regress there. Like, the way I understand what our view, and this may be a longer discussion than what we have time for right now, but I'll just add that it seems like there is some determinism that we account for, or kind of say that is true to some extent, because our character determines the kinds of actions that we take.
Yeah.
That is a form of determinism.
Yes, well, you can call it determinism. We don't like that term because it has other package deal implications. But you're right, that you do have to ask, all right, well, where does your character come from, right? Because there's a sense in which our actions and our choices form our character into the future. And so you have to ask, you have to go back to sort of the primal choice to focus or not when you first started out in life. What caused that?
That's what I'm.
Yeah. Did you have a character prior to that? And as Calvinists, we're going to say, yes, you had a character, a totally depraved character. You had a character that was inclined toward evasion and evil and unreality. And to the degree that you have not completely given into that, you will be reality oriented and non-evasive, etc. But fundamentally, the default is evasion.
I have a question for you guys on this idea from Ayn Rand. I don't remember where she says it, but and it might even be in Galt's speech, but she, in her thought, it's ridiculous to say that we all were born with an inclination to sin, and yet that we are morally accountable. And so this is not technically a discussion that falls only under epistemology, but we might bring it up here. Is it ridiculous, as she thinks it is, that we would have a sin nature and yet be morally accountable?
No, I don't think so. That's her. It is in Galt's speech. It's about the loaded dice.
Loaded dice.
Yeah. My question to her would be, what do you expect? Do you expect a characterless moral agent? Like, so, I mean, really the answer is there's no other option than to have quote unquote loaded dice when we're talking about moral agency, because the moral agent is an agent with a nature, with values, with inclinations or something, right? The objection to that has to assume that morality consists of perfect neutrality.
Yeah, what does she want? Regular dice, where you just get a random outcome? Like that seems like that's the only thing that
Exactly
could be left for her.
Yeah.
But even apart from that, I think that what she's doing there is the same thing that she says we shouldn't do with sense perception. We say, well, if it was really valid, it would look like this. What you propose is something that is like almost inconceivable when you get down to it.
And to draw the parallel even stronger with that, the idea is if it was legitimate, it would be totally neutral.
Yeah.
It would have no nature.
Yeah.
It would have no content. It would have no inclinations. It would be a void, right? And that's what all this boils down to. And that's why I keep on using that terminology. That really fundamentally, the idea behind libertarian free will is that in order for an act of the will to be legitimate, it must come out of the void. It must come out of some absolute form, some absolute state of neutrality that is not any more prone to the good than to the evil.
Well, you also run into her thing, or Peikoff's thing about the robot that doesn't know how to take one step in one place or the other. It's kind of like you worked so hard to avoid that in ethics, but with volition, you're like, no, but it is good to be that robot. That doesn't have any ability. It has an ability, but there's no reason for it to step one way or another. You know.
Mm-hmm.
We'll develop that a lot, because that is a point where I think all of us would agree there is a problem with Rand's thought. So that'll be useful. Let me summarize a couple of other things from my research. Just reading Edwin Locke's book, he pointed out on 112, consciousness is axiomatic, but is not material, but rather an emergent property of the brain. And I believe that's the consensus with the objectivists, is that consciousness is an emergent property. I just think it's not explicit in OPAR, but it's probably his view, and it's definitely the view of most objectivists. And then there was another section where Locke, in his book, The Illusion of Determinism, page 92, he says, you can choose differently under the same circumstances. This does not violate the law of identity, but reflects it. Now, I just want to say, when I hear that kind of line, and Peikoff uses the same kind of line, well, that's not a violation of it, that's an instance of it. I'm like, well, that might sound rhetorically powerful, but like, why could I not say just as easily, you are only ever free to do what you desire most, but not free to immediately change your desires. This does not violate the nature of volition, but reflects it.
Yeah.
I could say the exact, I mean, okay.
Well, I think it's worse than that, actually, because really what they're doing is they're denying it and then saying it isn't so. Like, basically what they're saying is man's nature is such that he is capable of contradicting his nature. That's essentially what they're saying. It would be like saying, well, the nature of a square is that it can sometimes be a circle. And that's not a violation of the law of identity, because that's just its nature. Like, it's absurd.
So if we were to take the implications of what they're saying, they result in a contradiction, and they can protest to the contrary all they want, just like a presuppositionalist can protest to the contrary all they want and say, well, according to our definitions, precept is true. Yeah, that's one of the things, but according to the implications, precept is false. So yeah, that's the way we would handle that. Now, that said, there is so much in this chapter that is useful. Although we've spent the time today disagreeing with Peikoff, most of the things in here are incredibly useful from the point of view of your psychoepistemology, from the psychology of how you approach decision making and what you need to be aware of when you do that. Namely, that you have the responsibility to focus on reality, and that if you don't do it, that's your choice, and you're accountable for that, and that will shape your character long range. All of that is true, and there's much that could be said about this chapter that Christians could benefit from. Well, that wraps us up on chapter 2, and next week we begin epistemology proper. So we'll look at differentiation and integration as the means to a unit perspective. And here what we are doing is accounting for how concepts are formed. In the history of thought, there have been many theories on what universals are and how they are formed, and how we know when we've done it correctly. But what Peikoff and Rand offer here is going to be an answer that is easy to understand, and that it helps us combat many of the skeptics and relativists and many of the, I would say, the Platonists. It helps us with have a reality-oriented approach to forming concepts. And to the extent that words matter and truth matters, your concepts matter. So this is going to be useful training. This is going to be the training that Christians need, in my opinion, then that they're lacking, and how to form their concepts in a way that is correct, in a way that is able to be understood by other people. So it's objective. You can report on how you formed your concept, and then people can correct the error if there's ever any errors. That's objectivity. This is incredibly useful if you were trying to have discussions about what theology is correct, or what political theory is correct, or ethical theory. And this is what is lacking in the Christian discussion. And so this is the reason why I am so enthusiastic about showing Ayn Rand and Peikoff's work to Christians, is understanding what epistemology is. And we are there. This coming Saturday, 9 a.m. Eastern, we are going to begin discussing epistemology for Christians, and we're going to begin plundering the pagans. Any other thoughts that anyone else wants to share before I wrap up? All right, well, I want to thank you for watching today. Please give this video a like and a share. Please get on our update list, christianintellectual.com/subscribe, and you can enroll in these webinars. They are ongoing all the way through August 2022. To enroll, go to christianintellectual.com/objectivism. Thank you for joining today, and I will see you next Saturday. God bless.